Let's say you're going to write a report or maybe a thesis for your bachelor's degree, your master's degree, or even a PhD. Or maybe you're writing an academic article or you just want to learn how to write better. I want to talk to you about how you can write using sort of academic English. And I'm going to focus here on English as the language of choice because certainly it's one of the most popular academic languages to write in. But that comes with a pretty big disclaimer that writing traditions vary based on culture and the language of use. And so in certain languages, it's maybe different than what I'm going to describe here. But the basic premise for writing academic English is to be understood. It's about communicating. I think a lot of people approach academic writing and they start thinking about like the biggest, most complicated terminology that they can use because they want to sound authoritative. They want to sound like they know what they're talking about. And that's, I guess, part of it is the language we're using, but fundamentally, if the language you use gets in the way of someone understanding what you're saying, then you're not so smart that you've figured out a way of confusing somebody, but you haven't figured out how to communicate effectively really complicated ideas to an audience who may or may not be experts in that field. So I think being able to communicate very clearly is important, and that means you're going to have to maybe take a step back from your own ego and think more about your audience, who you're trying to reach, than thinking about how you can make your own writing sound very authoritative and very as if you're thinking big thoughts, grand thoughts. So the number one thing to start off with is word choice. So when you start selecting the vocabulary that you want to use to describe a certain phenomena or a certain issue or a certain thing that you want to write about, you have a lot of choices in English. English is one of those languages that has like 1,000 synonyms for every word. So I want you to think about which words you're choosing to explain what you're going to explain to an audience, and be sure that you're choosing words that are going to be easily understood by that audience. This does not mean that you're simplifying what you're saying. What it means is you're explaining what you're thinking in a clearer and more effective way. And so if you've already written something, I would challenge you to go back through that writing and try to pick out terminology that you're using that you may be able to explain in more detail using words that are more easily understood by your audience. Now, this comes with a huge caveat that in most areas of science, there are terms of art that we use. And those terms are loaded with a lot of kind of detail, a lot of complexity many times. And so when we're explaining a term of art, it's absolutely necessary to give the reader a clear definition of what you mean by that term. So in my area, one of the things I talk a lot about is this idea of implementation. Now, we always have in our head what kind of implementation refers to. We always kind of think, oh, that's more or less what it is. But I would never let my reader, I'd never assume that my reader knows what I mean when I talk about implementation. And so it's necessary for me to define it. Implementation refers to putting an idea into practice, for example. And then if I'm drawing that definition from a specific area of the literature from other researchers, then I need to make sure that I'm referring to those researchers and maybe even providing the exact definition that they've used in their research and their writing. So that's a little bit about choosing your terminology, and I think that's really important as you're going through your writing to really question yourself in what ways are you choosing and selecting the words that you use to describe whatever it is that you're describing. So really be critical about your own word choices. And if you think you're using a word that's not a term of art, that you're kind of like, oh no, this is just the way I've thought about it, that's fine. But you might want to dig into the research, because chances are if it's a really specific term, then people have been researching it probably for hundreds of years. And they've come up with 1,000 different ways of conceptualizing and defining that term. And if you're going to write something scientific, you need to make sure that you're you're referring to those authors, to that research tradition, so that you can, so the reader better understands how you understand this area of science that you're dealing with. Now, the second really important thing here, a little bit more practical than just a choice of words, is conciseness. Now, conciseness, again, doesn't necessarily mean short. It means to the point. It means that you don't spend a lot of time using flowery language or using a lot of complex sentence structures. It means that you're very direct in your approach to explaining what it is you're explaining to your reader. So it's really important that we're being concise. All right, so what concise translates to in my world is using short sentences, sentences that get right to the point, but that maybe build off of one another in a very coherent way. So being able to state something that provides a little bit more detail or clarity to what you're saying, and then restate it or state something else that provides some additional clarity. It's really about being clear in your writing. So conciseness, short sentences, not using complex sentence structures, maybe 2 lines, 3 lines long. And if you want to learn bad practices in writing, read some of my publications, because I've learned this by making 1,000 mistakes. And I'm not perfect writer. I'm not even a great writer, I wouldn't say, but I am a writer, and I'm pretty well published. So I think you can learn by looking at bad examples too. And I think you can check out some of my publications in Google Scholar, or just throw my name into Google and you'll find some of my writing. The point I'm trying to make here is one sentence can go on 2 or 3 maybe lines. A single paragraph, maybe a half page at most, kind of 3 maybe to 5 sentences. I really am in favor of kind of short and clear paragraphs that capture a single idea. A sentence should capture a single idea in that sentence. And so if you find yourself trying to pack a lot of information into a sentence, break it out into 2 or 3 sentences. This is something that a lot of writers that are new to academic English struggle with, is just the basic, the fundamentals, which are, not putting 1,000 ideas into one sentence or 1,000 ideas into one paragraph. Really try to isolate, what am I trying to say in this sentence? What am I trying to say in this paragraph? And focus only on that. And if there's additional knowledge or information that you need to communicate, break it into another sentence, break it into another paragraph. And then sections. So you're going to have some headings and different ways of organizing your writing. For the lowest level sections, I always try to shoot for 3 to 4 paragraphs. I really find it problematic if a writer is only providing 1 paragraph under a heading. I think if that happens, it's a lot of the time it's because that 1 paragraph might belong to a different section. So you might need to combine sections. If a section heading only has 1 paragraph, chances are it only deserves 1 paragraph. Or it might deserve 2 or 3 paragraphs. So you might want to expand on whatever that topic is. So for sections, rule of thumb, 3 to 4 paragraphs, I would say. 2, fine. If I was going to review your paper, I wouldn't, split hairs. But I would probably give you a recommendation. Think about whether or not this belongs somewhere else, or it can be expanded on further. In terms of sentence structure, I always try to use the active voice. Now, passive voice is something a lot of early writers do because they think it sounds a little bit more academic because it removes the subject from the sentence. So if I was going to say something like, the paper was read by Anthony, or the paper was reviewed by Anthony, right? It takes a subject, which should be me, I'm the actor, I'm the one doing something, and puts it at the end of the sentence. So it puts the paper as kind of the actor, which the paper can't really do anything. But if you were going to phrase this actively, it would be Anthony read the paper, or Anthony reviewed the paper. So I think making sure that your writing is an active voice, as much as makes sense. Sometimes the passive voice just makes more sense, but a lot of times I find that especially early writers or writers who are new to the field will use the passive voice because they think it takes out that subject and it provides some like sense of objectivity. You don't want that in academic writing. Always put a subject at the beginning of a sentence. You should have subject, you should have a verb, and you should have an object, typically. So something does something to something. Now, there's this debate about whether or not we should be using first person pronouns, so I or we or anything like that in your academic writing. I'm a little bit lenient on this sometimes, so I kind of have like a 90-10 rule. 90% of the time I think you shouldn't be using first person pronouns. 10% of the time it's probably okay to use a first person pronoun. Most of the time I would use a first person pronoun in like the methods section, and I'll talk more about methods in another video. But 90% of the time, I find it's more stronger academic English to not use first-person pronouns. So what can you do instead? Well, if you're talking about a paper, or if you're talking about your thesis proposal, or you're just talking about your thesis, you can write "this thesis argues," or "this thesis shows," or the results show, or something along those lines, so that you're putting an actor, you kind of making the thesis the actor, which, there's some debate about whether or not that's appropriate or not, but that's typically the approach that I've taken, and I think it works pretty well. If you're talking about a specific author who has argued something, or a piece of research that has shown something, I often say something like "research shows," and then make a statement about what research might show, or this author, so Giannumis 2020 shows blah, 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 and kind of go into some detail about what the research was about. What are the kind of key issue that you want to draw out or show your reader as part of that, part of your literature review or whatever it is. So those are a few tips. So number one, make sure that you're being very clear in your language. So your word choice matters. Make sure you opt for words that are clearer rather than words that are more opaque, or words that are more concrete rather than words that are more abstract, or words that are more often used than more obscure words. So using plain language, using clear language is really important. Second one, make sure you're being concise. This is not your time to kind of wax philosophically, or maybe it is if you're doing a philosophy thesis, why not? But like, what I want you to think about is making your sentence structure very clear and to the point, making your paragraph structure very clear and to the point, to one point. 1 point for a sentence, 1 point for a paragraph. You don't need to make multiple points. And then making sure your sections are kind of worthy of being a section. Make sure you're dealing with one issue in that section, and make sure that there's enough content there to make it worth having a section. And then last, third point here, subject, verb, object, something does something to something. Make sure that you have that structure in all your sentences, and you will be a great and wonderful and likely well-published academic writer.